Good day. My name is Ken Laker. I'm the 1995 IEEE Vice President of Educational Activities. I also teach at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Electrical Engineering. It's my pleasure to be with you at whatever time you're viewing this tape to talk to you about professional vitality through lifelong learning. You may be asking why professional vitality and why lifelong learning is something that I choose to speak to you about. And I submit that at no time has the stakes been higher for the engineer and his or her employer for the engineer to maintain and enhance his or her professional vitality. My objective in this presentation is to heighten your sensitivity to the importance of consistent lifelong learning, to the engineer's continued professional development, and to seek your participation in the creation of change. And that's what I refer to in the title of the presentation with regard to a culture change. And so I will submit the question, is such a culture change needed? And I will hope that I will provide you with the proof that that culture change is indeed needed, and will invite you to participate in making it happen. My presentation will have three components. First, I'll relate to you the highlights and outcomes of Industry 2000. And then with Industry 2000 as a context, I'll talk to you about and propose the culture that I believe needs to be put in place to support lifelong learning, and then suggest some actions that we all can consider. To put the presentation into a context from an IEEE perspective, it's perhaps important for you to know that the IEEE has a strategic plan. And one of the objectives, one of the most important objectives of the strategic plan relates to career enhancement. And that objective is to empower IEEE members to realize lifelong careers in electrotechnology by providing a broad range of resources that will enable them to prosper and to develop and update their professional and technical competencies. In my opening, I referred to the stakes being so high, and you may be asking what has made those stakes so high? Well, I think it's pretty evident to most of us, certainly those of us in engineers. We don't have to go very far to recognize that the environment that engineers face in the workplace has changed dramatically over the last several years. One aspect of that change is the rapid change of technology, which renders education in engineering obsolete more quickly than perhaps we can imagine. Another important factor is the downsizing and flattening of organizations that are putting more demands on the engineer in areas that are non-technical, leadership skills, people skills, and to be broader as well as deep in their knowledge, technical knowledge. I think it's anticipated by many that the greatest employment growth in the future is going to be with smaller companies, which again is going to put more burden on the breadth of the engineer, both technically and non-technically. Globalization and the global economy and the global competition have changed the environment that our engineers face. And finally, the loss of jobs due to defense and research cuts. The cartoon illustrated on this overhead slide, I think very nicely illustrates this environment that I referred to. On the right, with the building with the steeple, is the university, where all of us graduate at some point with our formal degree, our formal education. And to the left, the palm trees represents retirement. And in the middle is that vast sea which we call our career. And much can happen in between the time we leave the academic institution and the time we retire in terms of how our career goes and how it prospers or it doesn't prosper. And the key, in my opinion, to careers prospering is maintaining professional vitality. It's very important. It's worthwhile at this point to explain to you what I mean by professional vitality. And my definition of that is having the competency, skills, current awareness needed to contribute to the mission of our employer, commensurate with our salaries, and to remain marketable at or above our current salary level. You may ask what I mean by continued professional development, and let me define that for you. And continued professional development represents all of these activities that we as engineers do to enhance and expand our skills in order to realize professional growth and enhance competency. That is, to maintain our professional vitality. I also speak about lifelong learning. I think it's worthwhile to understand what I mean by that as well. In lifelong learning, I refer to all of our career-relevant education, from the first engineering degree to retirement or beyond retirement. So it's truly lifelong learning in the context of one's engineering education. I'll also refer to continuing education. And continuing education, in my definition, is the educational component of lifelong learning which is not associated with earning formal academic degrees. And this is the component that I would like to speak most about with regard to the role that we can play in changing the culture. In the beginning of my presentation, I alluded to the obsolescence of engineering education over time, and this overhead slide is intended to illustrate that obsolescence with time in comparison with the competency required of us as engineers growing with time. And so the upper curve refers to the competency that we all need to develop and required of us in our jobs as time goes on. And the bottom curve refers to our growth in competency at t less than 0 in our formal education. And the curve after t equals 0 refers to what happens to that education if we do nothing about maintaining our skills and our professional competency through further learning, as I referred to lifelong learning and perhaps continuing education if no formal education occurs thereafter. And so it's extremely important for us as engineers to recognize that we must close that gap. And this is what the purpose of lifelong learning, and this is when that gap is closed, then I maintain and submit that one has maintained professional vitality. A very key event took place in May of 1994, which began to formalize our thinking about these issues. And this was a conference called Industry 2000, Technical Vitality Through Continuing Education. I should point out that you'll see technical vitality appear in a lot of these overhead slides, but please replace technical with professional, because technical is part of the vitality and the skills that we must maintain. Other non-technical skills that relate to people skills that I mentioned before, leadership skills, business, marketing, those kinds of things are extremely important today for engineers to be aware and to have good use of. This workshop brought together about 100 people from industry, academia, and government, and we carefully selected the participants to get balance between large companies, small companies, and medium-sized companies. The purpose of this event was to bring this group together, have a keen interest in the professional vitality of engineers, to discuss some of the issues that affect and that impede the engineer from maintaining his or her professional vitality. We analyze issues affecting the professional vitality of organizations and individuals. We identified hindrances or barriers to professional vitality, and we issued recommendations concerning career planning, professional development, and lifelong learning. It's very important that a group of volunteers for the IEEE stay the day after the meeting to recap what we had learned in that meeting and to formulate action items that we are presently now working. And you'll hear about those as I proceed through the presentation. Prior to Industry 2000, we did a survey of our participants and also those that we had invited who who could not attend about the major issues which they felt were facing engineers today. And you see those issues, the main ones listed here. The most prominent one was the uncertainty in the face of technology change. The second one, and perhaps related, was job security. The third was recognizing the need to develop business and communication skills. A third was professional status. Another was career management. Another was productivity, and the final one was time. And all engineers, I think, are feeling the pressure of time as more and more demands are placed on their work environment, and this certainly impacts the time and effort that goes into the maintaining of the professional vitality that I've mentioned. To begin discussing professional vitality, I think this quote from Bob Luckey, who is currently Vice President of Research at Belcor, is very appropriate. And I'll read that to you. When I got out of college, I only knew about vacuum tubes. Today, years later, I'm sitting in a lab filled with lasers and people working on optical computing. That's a long transition to make, and you can't do it without learning a lot of stuff along the way. That's what an engineer is about. You go to school, but you don't really learn a trade. You learn how to educate yourself. Extremely important, that last phrase, educate yourself. Because ultimately, the organization or individual who has the most at stake in terms of maintaining the engineer's professional vitality is the individual engineer himself or herself. And so I'd like to make it very clear that it's our position that individual professional growth and the productivity are the personal responsibility of each and every individual engineer. And this is a quote that also came out of the National Academy of Engineering. One of the issues that we learned in Industry 2000 that one must address in changing the culture regarding professional development and lifelong learning is process for lifelong learning. In particular, the process for the continuing education component of lifelong learning, which I submit there is none. This cartoon, I think, very nicely illustrates that. Who has time to figure out what to learn? And that's a real issue for most folks, including those of us in academia, by the way, who have things to do that get in the way of us keeping up our professional vitality as well, although I must submit that our job is certainly oriented more towards that than a lot of others. But to get a feel for what I mean here, let's consider the following hypothetical scene. You are starting your engineering studies at University X, and you are attending the freshman orientation. The Dean of Undergraduate Studies informs you that you have a package that's been put before you of all the college catalogs in the university. And he or she tells you at the end of 4 years that he or she will see you at exam time. And that exam will determine whether you are worthy of being an engineer or not, and whether you continue going through more and more education until that happens. No curriculum, no advisors, no support. It's all up to you. And I submit that's precisely the scene that exists right now for continuing education. There is no process. And moreover, there's no quality control in terms of the content. There's no form of accreditation that's done within engineering disciplines for continuing education that relate to engineering studies. This quote here by the Board of Engineering Education in 1994 speaks to that issue very nicely. And it says, most of the nation's nearly 3 million degreed engineers participate in formal continuing education at some point in their careers, and participation seems to be growing. However, continued education opportunities for engineers today are poorly integrated and not readily available to all engineers. And this is referring to process. In our formal education, we have process. The faculty have worked hard to develop the courses, the curricula that we have followed through our formal education. And that process exists for both undergraduate, master's, and PhD education. But once we get out of the formal educational environment, the process has all been lost. There is no process. And so I submit that one very important thing that we must do is begin to explore process. And we will have, in the near future, a workshop like Industry 2000 to bring together folks from academia and industry who have something of substance to say about process for education and training to begin to explore how we might do process for continuing education and lifelong learning. It's very important for us, in order to address change, to understand why we have to do change. And what are the barriers or hindrances faced by individuals? And in a moment, I'll talk about those by corporations regarding lifelong education. The first bullet, lack of individual strategy or plan, refers to process. And certainly we need the process regarding that's equivalent to process that exists in the formal education or analogous to that process for lifelong education. But also from the point of view of the engineer needs to be able to make the connection between the process for the education and the needs of his or her corporation. And so strategy and planning are as important for planning for lifelong education as it is for career, and we need to relate those together. The second bullet refers to the lack of coherent structure, which I have talked about, lifelong learning offerings. And I might also add quality. There's also the difficulties in accessing continuing education opportunities. Often they're short courses in areas that are distant from where one works, and the cost in time that's required to engage in those opportunities is beyond perhaps the resources that many engineers have. Lack of time for professional development. I hear that a lot. And I submit that it's either pay me now or pay me later. The people I know who have the most enjoyable after work time are those who are confident about their professional vitality. They're not concerned about whether they're going to be laid off or not, because they know that if they are, or if the company direction changes, that they can walk out of that company instantaneously and get another job. And in fact, if they put the word out that they were looking for a job, they might have 5 headhunters approaching them, seeking their services. And put that in contrast with an individual who has not put the time and done it on a continuous basis in maintaining his or her professional vitality. Those folks, I submit, tend to, in times when they would be otherwise enjoying themselves, are concerned, and perhaps that concern diminishes the quality of their time outside of work. The high cost of education is something that we must deal with. And the real or perceived lack of employer support. One of the barriers which is common, which is certainly a theme through the barriers that I have just gone through, and will be common with that of the employer, is the subject of return on investment. Neither the individual or the employer really see it, and there's good reason for it. There's no process. The quality of the content is questionable and certainly not controllable. And the relationship between the courses and education and professional development activities to the needs of the corporation, the job, are not, those connections are not well made. The employer issues are very similar in the sense of the return on investment. Some perceive the near-term focus as being an issue, and in fact that may be, but nonetheless companies are in business to make money, and as we'll see later, there is a direct correlation between the professional vitality of engineers and the economic success of that corporation. Education is not perceived as a controllable cost, not a worthwhile investment. Again, return on investment. Training must match current corporate needs, and that's a challenge which befalls both the engineer and the employer. The engineer must work to making the connection between the education that he or she wants to do to the corporate needs, and the corporation needs to very clearly express the needs of the corporation and help the individual make that relationship. It's considered the individual responsibility. There's no question that lifelong learning and professional development is the individual responsibility, but I submit that the benefits to be derived will be best derived if it's dealt with as a partnership between the individual and the corporation. And the final is a lack of consistent message about the importance of maintaining technical or professional vitality. All very important issues that we must all work on as employers and engineers to help bridge the gap and to begin to beat down these barriers in order to make professional vitality and lifelong learning, that culture, something that is supportive rather than working against us. Now that I have talked to you about the barriers and hindrances, both the employer and the individual, I'd like to talk about some of the recommendations that we have. And these recommendations are based on Industry 2000 and our processing of what we learned in Industry 2000. And also based on experience that I have had in my 20-year career, both as a member of industry as well as a professor, and speaking with lots of engineers all over the world. And the recommendations that I'm going to address, I'll do as in the following manner. I earlier in the title of my talk referred to the culture change. And the culture has 4 dimensions. The first and most important is the individual. The second is the employer, the industry that employs our engineers. The third are the universities that educate our young people who go out into the engineering workplace and also have an important role to play in helping develop process for the entire lifelong learning process and to provide content for the continuing education and lifelong learning of our engineers. The final component is the professional society. And there, I believe, the professional society has a tremendous challenge and opportunity to provide real substantive value to membership in the professional society by catalyzing this culture change. This is a very important opportunity and responsibility that I believe the professional society has. And they perhaps are uniquely well placed to do it because they are the level playing field. The individuals that I talk about are the members of the professional society. The companies have for years supported professional society activity and send engineers to a large number of IEEE conferences and workshops and meetings. The universities produce the students who are our members, and the faculty of those universities are also our members and are participating in developing the journals and the presentations at conferences that are foremost part of IEEE, as well as the educational material that is available through IEEE. And so, where better to formulate and bring these pieces of the culture together than the professional society? So let me begin with the individuals. The first bullet is to accept personal responsibility for career planning and lifelong education. When I was a young engineer joining AT&T Bell Laboratories about 20 years ago, very soon after I joined, my boss came to me and said, you know, Ken, I'm a pretty good boss, and I really consider part of my job is helping you plan your career and to seeing you enjoy a very healthy and career and to reach your full potential. But on the other hand, nobody in this corporation has more vested interest in you succeeding than you. And so I implore you to take responsibility yourself and to work with me to ensure your success in this corporation. And I never forgot that. And I think it was very wise advice, and I want to impart that here. The second is to maintain and improve basic technical skills. And I might add some other non-technical skills as well. We often, when we leave our formal academic education, say, well, that calculus that we learned or that physics we learned are no longer relevant. Far from it. It's very important to think in terms of intellectual conditioning as one goes through one's career. We do that routinely for physical conditioning. I don't believe that any one of us would ever expect that a professional basketball player would give up practicing foul shots or give up practicing passing or the very basic skills of basketball, even though they're professionals. So why should we think as engineers that we would stop practicing the basic skills that are important for our livelihood? And so those need to be maintained and enhanced, particularly from the point of view of sophisticated application of those skills, so as we move along and look at new areas of technology as they develop, make career changes, that we're ready to do so. We can go read a book when we want to. We can go take a course and get the most out of that course because our basic skills are current and fresh. And let's face it, in most jobs, that doesn't happen. And that's something that one must do and do it on a continuous, incremental basis so that the burden is not great and at the same time that intellectual conditioning is maintained. Only through that can you do the third bullet, and that's to keep up with the advances in relevant technology. Because without those basic skills, those things are a bunch of words, and they are not, keeping up is very, very difficult, if not impossible. The fourth bullet refers to broadening, and that's the learning of business and communication skills. It's very important to be able to link the technology with the marketplace and to understand the business conditions that relate to that technology. It's no longer possible to separate those. They must be integrated. And I mentioned teamwork and communication skills. It's more and more important that one has to be able to communicate the ideas, not only have the ideas, but to communicate them well. Working in teams involves people skills and leadership skills. Today, I find very few things that can be done by individuals in engineering. 20 years ago, individuals did many things. And even in academia, the concept of individual contribution is beginning to be relooked at, perhaps belatedly, but nonetheless, that's being challenged today because the technology and the kinds of things that we're doing interdisciplinary require groups of people to work together. And finally, to be active in the professional society. Just receiving the periodicals and attending the conferences, doing that does not give the individual member nearly all of the opportunity that one can get from being a member of a professional society. Being active and participating in leading is a tremendous opportunity to learn leadership skills, to learn how to build consensus, and to do it in a friendly environment, because the worst that can happen is you get fired. From a volunteer job, sometimes that's not a bad thing to happen. But nonetheless, it's a very friendly and important way in which one can develop these leadership skills and have an impact on the profession as well. It's very important, when we talk about lifelong learning, to not think of just in time. That's a big buzzword today in engineering, but when it comes to lifelong learning, just in time is just too late. And to decide 5 years or 10 years after completing one's formal education, it's time to go back and do something is often too late. Or to wait until you realize that the job that you have is becoming obsolete or might be eliminated to determine that you need to go learn something new. It's too late. And so that continuous, incremental approach to lifelong learning is what is really needed. Don't delay it. Start now. Now I'd like to address the industry recommendations. And this particular quote from Ray Wattups, who's the vice president at Motorola. This quote came from his speech at Industry 2000, and I think it's extremely appropriate and valuable to reflect on. And Ray says, "I think the goal should be to prepare our workforce to be the most productive people anywhere in the world. If your company, your state, or your community has the most productive workers job for job of any workers in the world, you won't have economic problems. You won't have crime problems. I think most of our problems can be solved by having the most productive workers in the world." And this is what employers, you should be striving for. The recommendations from industry came from a study that was done by Paul German of IBM. And he did a study where he examined, if you will, the professional vitality attitudes of several companies and related that to their commercial success and found a very strong correlation to those companies that were very proactively promoting professional vitality among their engineering employees or all their employees, right from the top of the company to the bottom of the company, were also the ones that were enjoying the most commercial success. And his recommendations as a summary of that study are as follows. Engineers should view their work as important and vital and do not tolerate mediocrity. This is an attitude that companies should instill in their engineers. Management at all levels should lead continued professional development by example, that is, actively working on their own continued professional development and wear it on his or her shirt sleeve. Make it very apparent to the employers that they are doing so. We found that companies that do this also found it very effective for engineers to interact with customers. And this was both a payoff and also a measure of how professionally vital their engineers were, because they discovered that those interactions with customers by their engineers, when they went well and the engineers were perceived as being professional vital, added to the credibility of their corporation and usually enhanced their probability of getting the contract or making the sale, as opposed to when the customer perceives those engineers as not being professionally vital, and I think you can expect that the credibility would diminish if that were to be perceived. And so this was a very important reason for encouraging engineers to be professionally vital and for also measuring through the feedback from customers. The final bullet was to develop a strong linkage of continued professional development programs to the company's goals and objectives. And this is a two-way street. In my opinion, it's not only the responsibility of the company to articulate the goals and objectives and help the engineer make that relationship, but the engineer should go out of his or her way to make that relationship as well, and in selecting and doing their continued professional development. I'd like to now talk about universities. And this quote from Frank Splitt, who is a former vice president of Northern Telecom, who is now a chair professor at Northwestern University. And he states that engineers have to know that their very survival depends on lifelong education. He says most of them don't. They were taught in school to be absorbers. They were tested to be absorbers, not to learn what they had to learn and how to learn it. And this is a challenge to us academics, to make the change to prepare our students properly for lifelong education. The next quote comes from a workshop on restructuring engineering education, a focus on change, that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation a year ago, June. And this is a workshop that I participated in, and the National Science Foundation has been extremely proactive in supporting almost revolutionary change in undergraduate engineering education and is very keen on the notion that preparation for lifelong learning is very important. Again, I'll read this quote. Most engineers experience major job changes during their career. The undergraduate engineering program can no longer ignore the fact that it cannot provide all the necessary knowledge for graduates to remain competitive in their careers. It must educate the student for life, not just for the initial job. Students must know how to learn and must be able to assess their skills and educational needs. But given that preparation, we still yet have to develop the process and the planning tools that support the students who now come out ready and able to do their lifelong learning, to manage it and to connect it to their careers. And so there's a lot of change that needs to take place, and certainly a first place to start is right in the academic institutions with the education of our young people. So we have the following 4 recommendations for universities. First is to instill excitement of learning during the undergraduate years. The second is to expose students to professional aspects of engineering, including ethics, legal obligations, business, communications, and teamwork, people skills, leadership, etc. Encourage students to become active in a professional society. This may seem to be a strange recommendation because, in fact, some of the bastions, if you will, of the IEEE are the academic folks who are producing the papers in journals, many of the papers in journals and the international conferences. But I submit that we don't do enough to relate to our students what we have benefited from being a member of the professional society and being a very active and involved member as well. And finally, to consider a more proactive role in providing lifelong learning opportunities. And I'll submit a 5th one, is to help in developing the processes for the continuing education component of lifelong learning. This particular overhead slide is to try to relate what I believe is the opportunity for universities. The formal education, the Bachelor of Science, the Master of Science, and the PhD degrees is really only a very small part of the educational needs of engineers. Once they leave the academic institution and go on, this is only maybe 8 years or 10 years of a 50-year period from the time a student begins their academic education to the time they retire. The remaining 40 years represent an opportunity for institutions to not only to provide education, which is what they're there to do, but to also perhaps develop relationships that are very meaningful with their alumni. And I know there are universities that are beginning to look this way and to think about these kinds of programs. The role of universities in lifelong education, I'd like to talk about. And then this overhead slide represent them as questions, but I'll talk to them as statements and be more positive. Not what the role is, but of universities in helping to define the curricula or the process for lifelong education. But in fact, this is a real opportunity and a challenge for academic institutions to participate in this changing culture and to make a very important contribution to the lifelong education of their graduates and engineers in general. The second is to deliver relevant lifelong education. And it's very important that that education be accessible anytime, any place. Part of the return on investment I alluded to before was the notion that the short courses that are delivered being only available in certain cities or locations around the country are not very accessible to a lot of folks. Engineers who work in small companies, engineers who work in companies that are far away geographically from that particular educational experience don't have the opportunity. Also, a 3-day short course is not incremental. That's 3 days away from the job. For an individual who is a consultant or in a small company, that may be 3 days without earning any income. And so education has to become such that it can be done incrementally, anywhere, anytime. And so using information technologies to make that happen is very important. And I think there's a role here for the universities to play and to derive, if you will, another source of revenue. The other is for universities to form partnerships with industry and professional societies to foster lifelong education and career development. In preparing students for lifelong learning, universities have challenges. Students need to learn to manage their own lifelong learning. And how can universities help that? What kind of, again, the partnerships with the professional society, I think, can be very helpful here. Universities must instill effectively the need for lifelong learning in their students. And in fact, the new accreditation guidelines for engineering programs in the United States will have a very clear objective that universities must demonstrate that they are preparing their students for lifelong learning. This is different than what has been in the criteria in the past. Another important question here is, what role should universities play in helping students develop their careers? Right now, we think in terms of the education that the students receive, it's oriented towards developing skills, very fundamental skills, but very little is done to help the student make the transition from the university to going out into the workplace. And some universities are beginning to do some of this through linking students to industry for their senior design projects. But there are other things that we can do. And again, this refers to this partnership that it can be very valuable between the universities and industry as well as professional societies. And finally, what universities make the importance of active professional society participation in career development, something that we can do together. And as long as we realize that this is we all agree that this is important for our students. And finally, I'd like to talk about, in terms of the recommendations, those for professional societies. The first is to develop career planning tools that provide a roadmap to lifelong learning. And this is, again, an area that, although I put it in the recommendations for professional societies, clearly requires a partnership with academic institutions as well as industry. And I had mentioned earlier about a workshop that we're going to hold in the early part of next year that will address some of these issues. And that also the Educational Activities Department with volunteers are actively engaged in developing tools of this type with other engineering societies. The second is to establish a centralized database of continuing education programs and materials so that all members can be aware of what's available everywhere in the nation as well as the world in terms of what's available through IEEE, and over time expand that to include other programs and materials that are available external to IEEE. Third is to support a forum for lifelong learning best practices and to recognize and give visibility to those companies and universities who are doing really good work in this area of lifelong learning. The fourth is to provide appropriate measures for recognizing participation. I think it's very important for professional societies to consider recognizing the continued professional development of their engineers, of their members. Today, the grades of membership within IEEE and at least most of the other engineering professional societies measure their accomplishment up to the point in which the grade of membership is bestowed, but says nothing about their professional vitality 1, 2, 10 years beyond the earning of that recognition. And so I think it's both a challenge and a responsibility for the professional societies to consider providing some form of recognition for continued professional development and that's related to lifelong learning, however that's done or accomplished by the member. And the final is to exploit information technologies to make education more accessible and affordable. And I'll relate a fifth one, which I think is very important, which relates to the second bullet on the database for continuing education programs and materials, and that's to do review, peer review. IEEE and most professional societies are well recognized for the peer review that's done for the papers that appear in journals and at conferences, and the quality of the IEEE periodicals and conferences are the best in the world. A challenge will be to apply that same process or a similar process as far as lifelong learning programs are concerned, so that we can alert members, in particular to those programs which are very good and realize the learning objectives that are important to them. This next cartoon kind of captures, if you will, what we think about any time, any place regarding education. Here's an individual who obviously can do nothing else but stare at a monitor. And isn't this a wonderful opportunity for that individual to catch up or to do that incremental intellectual conditioning that's part of maintaining one's professional vitality? I had alluded that there are opportunities, and I think very important, for university, industry, and professional societies to partner. What are some of the possibilities? One is to focus on this issue of process for lifelong learning. I referred to curricula, but perhaps a better word is process. That enables an individual to at least see a standard, if you will, that they could follow and perhaps modify to their needs. But as I pointed out, right now there is no process, there is no concept of curricula for that continuing education component of lifelong learning. To work together to develop applications-oriented continuing education courses and materials that are not only intellectually rich, but are also very relevant to the needs of industry and help engineers maintain their jobs, to move into new careers perhaps. But the importance here is to integrate intellectual quality with relevance. And the third is to work together to facilitate the use of information technologies in the delivery of education. Now, information technologies has two very important roles to play. And one is the anytime, any place, to make it accessible in increments of time which are determined by the individual, not by the instructor. But to also use mixed media in order to enhance learning, to make that learning, that material more visual, to make it more intuitive. And so one can use the technology to not only to enhance the delivery in any time, any place perspective, but to also enhance the learning and the access of that content to the individual. And finally, I believe that all these things are going to happen. And I believe that they're going to happen a heck of a lot faster if we do them together. And if we do, I think that the process of professional vitality and keeping up with technological change, as well as the industrial change and environment that takes place, can be a much more progressive and gracious process than exists today. And so I really hope that what you've gotten out of this presentation is a sense of need to help and to work, for us all to work together to make this culture change occur and to provide the opportunities for lifelong learning and continued professional development that our engineers need as we approach the 21st century. Thank you.